Hey guys, I am going to talk to you about commas today. Commas are challenging. I think that they are one of the most challenging aspects of writing, just in terms of making sure that you have proper grammar and mechanics. This lecture is going to be quick, a to-the-point rundown of what you need to know essentially to complete this week's Moodle activity. The really ultimate thing I want to say about commas in any grammar area or grammar aspect that you might struggle with is read. Because how do you get better at grammar? You read as much as you can. And I think sometimes people think, how is reading going to help me? Because I'm not going to understand where to put commas if I don't know what the rule is. I will just see a bunch of commas. But our brains are very, very good at recognizing patterns. And the more you read, the more you notice the location of commas and how the sentences are functioning with commas. So read as much as you can, because that's how you get better at grammar. It's just as simple as that. With this video, however, I am going to talk specifically about some comma elements. I'm not covering everything, and I'm not even covering probably everything that there is to cover within these 4 items, but I am going to talk about interrupters, lists, the pair of clauses where dependent comes before independent, and then also introductory phrases. So we're going to get started with interrupters. I am probably going to adjust my little box up here 1,000 times. Okay, so what is an interrupter? It's a phrase written in the middle of your sentence that disrupts the flow of your sentence. It can add essential information so that you are getting a detail of the sentence. It can add non-essential information that really isn't that important, but it's just like extra. And that's usually why people use interrupters. Sometimes we use interrupters in our speech and we don't even realize it. So how do you use commas with an interrupter? Well, if you are going to break up the flow of that sentence, then you want to signal, and that's really what a comma is doing, is it's signaling to the reader, hey, I'm going to kind of switch it up a bit. So you have your sentence, and imagine if you ripped it in half and you inserted that interrupting or disruption, whatever that phrase is, you put it in the middle of the sentence to signal to your reader that that chunk of words is an interrupter. You put commas before and after the interrupter. Now, one really quick way to know that you have an interrupter and that you've done this accurately is to read what comes before the interrupter and after the interrupter out loud to yourself and skip the interrupter. So what you're saying out loud should still sound like a logical and grammatically correct sentence. So in my example, and I've highlighted here in yellow the commas that are separating off that interrupter, I'm saying I really didn't, to be quite frank, like the flavor of this chicken at all. So my interrupter is the phrase, to be quite frank, and I'm just kind of really giving a little more emphasis on how I feel, adding some bits to my emotion, and I think it adds a little bit of attitude to this sentence. Without it, I would still understand the content of the sentence and it would still make grammatical sense, because I would just say, I really didn't like the flavor of this chicken at all. But, you know, to be quite frank, that's sort of fancy. So we're learning more about the speaker. So that's an interrupter. You will find at least one example of an interrupter in the example paragraph that we will be kind of focusing on this week. How about lists? I think that this is the easiest of all the comma rules, but the Oxford comma is something we should talk about. So a list is just a series of 3 or more items. 2 items make a pair, not a list. How do you use commas with a list? You want to place a comma after each item within the list, except for that final item. I'll show you an example of that below. Real quick though, what is an Oxford comma? An Oxford comma is sort of like debated. I mean, some people say you need to have the Oxford comma 100%. Other people say it's not a requirement. In my opinion, I think that you should use the Oxford comma because it adds clarity to your writing, but I will never penalize you if you choose not to use the Oxford comma. All I ask is you be consistent in your essay. You write your whole essay using Oxford commas or not using Oxford commas. The Oxford comma is the comma that comes before the word and or the word or within your list. So let's look at this example. We have 2 regular commas and 1 Oxford comma. I would much prefer to eat shrimp, lobster, steak, or buffalo than chicken. So there's how many items are in this list? That's really the question. We have shrimp, we have lobster, we have steak, and we have buffalo. So there's 4 items in our list. Chicken is not our list. We're comparing these 4 items to the chicken, but that's not part of our list. So remember the comma rule. We want commas after each item within the list, but not the final item. So we're not putting a comma after buffalo, but we are putting a comma after shrimp and lobster 100%. And the comma that you see highlighted in that aqua blue, the comma in between steak and the word or, is the Oxford comma. That's the one that's debated. That's the one that we say, well, I think you should have it there, but some people don't require it. I think when I was a kid, my teacher said, like, no, you don't put a comma there. So it's kind of weird. Okay, that's a list. I think it's pretty easy to understand. So this is the hardest aspect of commas, and this right here, this whole concept of clauses, independent, dependent clauses, is what gives students the hardest time if they are not, again, like avid readers at a young age and really have developed a sense of where do you put commas when you have these types of clauses. So I'm going to start at the basics. A clause is a phrase with a subject and a verb. A subject is the person or object performing the action, and a verb is the action. So if I said, I walked to class, then I am the one doing the action. So I is the subject, and walk or walked, I don't know what I said, whatever, is the verb, because who's doing the action and what action is it? That is the verb, right? Subject, verb, I walk. It gets more complicated than that, but that's a very simple example. So if we know that a clause has a subject and a verb, then we can say, well, there's lots of clauses out there. Sometimes a clause can be its own sentence. That's an independent clause. Think of its own sentence. It can stand on its own. It's like an independent person. It doesn't need to rely on anything else. But then you have a dependent clause, and it depends on something. It can't be its own sentence. The dependent clause depends on the independent clause, which means you can't have a dependent clause as its own sentence. How can you identify a dependent clause? Well, it has a word. It's a subordinating conjunction. You can go to Google and look up a list of subordinating conjunctions. There's a lot, but some examples are before, after, meanwhile. A dependent clause starts with a word like that. So when you have, I'm jumping down to what is the comma rule. When you have a dependent clause, again, it's going to have a subject and a verb, so it's pretty much going to be a complete thought, but it has that subordinating conjunction before it. So it starts with before, after, meanwhile, or some word like that. When it has that dependent clause first in a sentence and then follows up with an independent clause, all in one sentence, you need to put a comma in between those 2 clauses. If, on the other hand, an independent clause comes before a dependent clause, then you don't need a comma, because that subordinating conjunction is going to end up in the middle of the sentence instead of at the beginning, and it's going to function as the comma. So again, all of this in talk is confusing, but maybe we should talk about an example. So look at the bottom of your screen. Before we were able to enter the stadium, comma, we had to wait in line. Let's identify all the elements of this sentence, and then we can talk about the comma again. First of all, which clause is the dependent clause? The dependent clause is before we were able to enter the stadium. So it starts with that subordinating conjunction, and it relies on more information. I mean, imagine this. What if I just came up to you and I said, hey, before we were able to enter the stadium, and then I walked away? You'd be like, Before what? What did you have to wait for? What were you holding out for? So there's more information that's required. It's not just like, do we have enough details? It is that the sentence relies on more information on that independent clause. By process elimination, or by, being able to identify an independent clause, we can say then that we had to wait in line is our independent clause. Again, if I came up to you and I said, hey, we had to wait in line, you might say, well, what were you waiting for, or why were you in line? But the grammar of that clause doesn't require that I give you any more information. Whereas because we had the word before in the dependent clause, we are waiting for something that's connected to that word before. So dependent, independent. Which word is the subordinating conjunction? Before, right? That's our subordinating conjunction. That's the word that says, hey, we need more information. So we've got this thing. We have a dependent clause coming before an independent clause, which means we need to separate the two with a comma. Had we, however, said we had to wait in line before we were able to enter the stadium, we would not need a comma at all. Isn't grammar fun? All right, we have one more slide here that I want to talk about, and that is the introductory phrase. It's exactly as it sounds. It is a phrase, not a clause, but it's a phrase, so it essentially means shorter than a clause, doesn't have a subject and a verb. It's often something that comes at the beginning of a sentence that tells you the location, the time, or the sequencing. Something like the example here. First, I'd like to say that I had a marvelous time, which suggests there's going to be something else that you want to say, right? After that introductory phrase, you put a comma. How do you check for accuracy? Well, read the sentence without the introductory phrase, so whatever comes after that comma, and it should make sense on its own logically and grammatically. And if it doesn't, then there's something wrong with the second part of the sentence, or maybe you didn't need a comma there. Okay, so those are the 4 comma subjects that we're going to be talking about this week, and I'm going to have you identify those within your Moodle activity for this week. I will place a link to the slides these 5 slides that you've been looking at with me in the FYI section for the week. So if you need to come back to it, you certainly can. In the FYI section is also the page numbers for the comma section of your Little Seagull handbook. So you can get more information on this and other commas there as well. All right, email me if you have any questions, losburn@mitchellcc.edu. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a good week. Happy commas, happy writing, happy week 3.